My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome to this latest episode of Diplomatic Immunity. As always, I'm your host, Kelly McFarland, and today is going to be a continuation of our America at 250, where we've been looking at some of the key moments and actors in U.S. foreign relations history. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Lindsay Chervinsky, who is an American presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. And I'm actually drinking out of my Mount Vernon coffee mug today. Lindsay is the author of the award-winning books, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, and Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. She's also co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Lindsay, thanks for joining us. And this is actually your second time on the podcast. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite people. And I know Lindsay's a big fan of this guy too. I think both of us have named our dogs after him, if that's correct. But that's none other than John Quincy Adams. My Quincy is almost 12 and a half. So he's more of like House of Republicans, John Quincy Adams now. But we're going to talk about...
Wait, what kind of dog is your Quincy? Because my Quincy is 12.
Oh, so he's a like a shepherd hound mix. He's about 55 pounds.
Oh my gosh, mine is a
sleeping
big
around here
hound
somewhere, but...
too. So this is just
Okay.
meant to be.
Okay, yeah, no, Quincy's a good dog, but he's getting up there these days. But yeah, it's funny you ask what kind of dog he is, because we did one of those like DNA testing things when he was like a year old, and it came back and it told us he was like a Shih Tzu and a cockapoo or something like that. And we sent it back and we're like, with a picture, and we're like, can we have our $80 back? Just this isn't even close. But
Yeah.
anyways, so he was a rescue, so we don't really know exactly, what he is, but he's a good dog regardless. And speaking of the real man, John Quincy Adams, so today we're going to get into a little bit of the Monroe presidency. Obviously, we'll talk about the Monroe Doctrine, which is very timely as well. But before we do that, and we've had episodes talking about Revolutionary War period, the Adams the dad, Jefferson, and then Madison War of 1812. So before we get into the actual Monroe Doctrine, I want you to sort of set the stage for us. Monroe comes after Madison, serves 2 terms, and John Quincy Adams is his Secretary of State before he becomes president, which back then was the stepping stone to the presidency. So what was going on sort of post 1814, the war ends, and Monroe comes in with Adams in 1817. And there's some big stuff that happens before the Monroe Doctrine. Some major treaties are signed. So kind of walk me through what their view on foreign policy was and how this partnership, very successful partnership between Monroe and Adams, worked in the late 18-teens.
Well, I think one of Monroe's best decisions as president was to appoint John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State and then to let him do the job, which is a really critical second part of that decision, because Monroe had really only had one stint as a diplomat, and it had gone quite poorly when he was ambassador to France. Technically the title was minister at the time, but for our purposes, he was the ambassador to France during Washington's administration, and he was recalled because he was too friendly to the French, and he was too pro-French Revolution and not pro-United States enough. And John Quincy Adams had really been all over the world and had unbelievable experience with every major power that the United States might have to deal with. And so not only did James Monroe understand that there was value in having a New Englander in the most powerful position, it would give the cabinet balance and it would unify the administration and the party, which he was actually criticized for doing because some people felt like he was handing over the presidency to a New Englander, which he did. But it was a really smart and really savvy choice, especially as his presidency, as you said, was kind of this turning point.
Right.
The War of 1812 was largely seen and talked about as the Second War of American Independence. And once it effectively ended in a draw, there was this interpretation of that moment as, okay, the United States actually is going to be a real nation. It is not going to be folded back into the British Empire. It's not going to be folded into a different European empire. The likelihood that it's going to split off into a bunch of different pieces is much reduced. And so for, I think, the period basically between Washington's presidency and Monroe's presidency, there was always that possibility, at least in the minds of Europeans, that this might be a very short-lived republic and it might just get folded back into the European system. So once there was realization that that wasn't going to happen, then that raises a lot of questions of, okay, so what is the relationship between this nation and the rest of the European nations going forward? And what do their borders actually look like? And this had been a source of real friction with Britain in the West, in the Ohio Country, and sort of the border of Canada, but also the declining power of Spain in the Southwest. And there were some thoughts about Russia up in the Pacific Northwest as well. Americans had long thought that they would kind of eventually take over the continent, or at least some did. This is the concept sort of manifest destiny. But this was the first time that Europeans started thinking about it. And those questions and those conversations and those relationships were really John Quincy Adams' portfolio over the next 8 years. And the big moment, he signs a number, or he negotiates a number of treaties. He sort of stakes a claim to the Pacific for the nation. He avoids conflict with Russia in the Pacific Northwest. But the big moment is the Adams-Onís Treaty in the Southwest, which basically arranges for the purchase of the Floridas from Spain.
Yeah, and really sort of like you talked about, there's multiple issues of borders and obviously in this time period, these aren't like, there's not like border guards and you don't have to show a passport to get from like Georgia to Florida and Alabama, things like that. So that people are crossing these borders. And so it's a very important issue to get these stamped out. And they are able to do that with Spain. And sort of, sets the stage, as we'll talk more about in this podcast as well, as sort of that continued expansion westward throughout the century. But so moving to the big one, the Monroe Doctrine. So, obviously it's tied to the president's name, but this is sort of John Quincy Adams' baby. So where does this stem from? How does this come about? Because I know there's a lot of discussion about, this being a British proposal in some ways, and that we kind of said no to. And, so what is it? Where did this stem from, and what is it actually saying?
I'm so glad you asked that way, because I think the context makes it actually a little bit less brash. It seems like this unbelievably impetuous statement of imperial domination, but in the context of how it emerged, it actually seems a little bit less bold. I mean, it's still incredibly bold, but it seems a little bit less bold. So it came about in a couple of ways. After the Napoleonic Wars, Russia had aligned with a lot of the more conservative religious powers in Eastern Europe and had set about reimposing monarchical rule in places like Spain and in Austria, and had signed a number of treaties and put their sort of puppet rulers back on the throne and crushed rebellions in places like Spain in order to do so. And so there was this alliance of more conservative, very religious powers. And there was discussion that maybe that alliance would then turn its attention to South America and to Latin America and to Mexico, where a number of nations had declared independence and won their independence from the Spanish Empire, which had been crumbling over several decades. Spain did not have the power itself to reassert its authority, but Russia had a massive, massive army. And so if it did bring its army to the Western Hemisphere, it theoretically could reimpose Spanish imperial rule, which would be sort of a puppet for Russian imperial rule. Great Britain didn't really want Russia doing that because it would interfere with their trade routes. British ships, at this point, largely, Britain didn't really have a whole lot of colonial holdings in the Western Hemisphere. There were a few Caribbean holdings, but by and large, their focus was east. But they had an enormous trade with the especially new republics in South America and Latin America. And so they didn't want any other imperial power interfering with that trade and setting up a closed economic system in which they wouldn't have access to. So British forces offered to the United States through John Quincy Adams this idea of partnering to close off any attempt by Russian forces or Russian-backed Spanish forces to reimpose this colonial rule. So Adams came to Monroe and said, we should not accept this offer because it will entrench us in a subordinate secondary position. We will always be second-class citizens if we accept this offer. That's really important because at this point, Jefferson and Madison, Monroe's two predecessors, were all aligned with the idea, the concept of the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll get to in a second, but they thought that Monroe should actually accept this offer. So the rejection of this offer was really John Quincy Adams' key contribution. So the Monroe Doctrine is actually 3 documents. It's a letter responding to the British saying thanks but no thanks. We'll see what happens in the future. Maybe we'll enter into a partnership, but right now let's go it alone. It is a response to the Russian emperor, Emperor Alexander, an actually fairly punchy letter by John Quincy Adams, basically saying, hands off the Western Hemisphere and your religious principles are not really welcome here. And then it is the presidential address, in which Monroe sends a written presidential address because, of course, presidential addresses from Jefferson to Wilson were in writing, and it lays out the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, which is not that the United States is going to be an imperial power, but rather that the Western Hemisphere is closed to further intervention by European empires. Wherever they currently had holdings, the United States would not mess with, but the United States would try and block any further participation. So it is sort of a response to these provocations by the Russians and by the offer by the British, and it is really those 3 pieces that lay out the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, and you noted that it's a bold proposition, and in part, it's a bold proposition because we really can't enforce that in 1823. And we turned down the British option, and they could, maybe not in every instance, but had a much better chance of enforcing that because of the size and power of the British Navy. So what role did the British actually play in this, even though they weren't really part of it? And Adams obviously knows that they're making these statements, but can't really enforce it. So how did that play into all of this?
He does. This is where I think John Quincy Adams' understanding of the global community and the various stakes at play is so important. He says in a cabinet meeting when they were discussing whether or not to accept this offer, because many of the other cabinet members were in favor of it as well. He said it would be more dignified to come in as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war than to accept this offer, which I love. It's such a colorful phrase. The reason it actually works is because it suited the British to basically uphold the Monroe Doctrine. It suited their own interests, and they were planning to anyway, which is why they made that offer. But they could have very easily tested it, and they could have had the British Navy not been there, the Russian army could have marched into sailed and then marched into South America, and we couldn't have really done anything about it. So it's only because our interests were aligned with British interests, and we could rely on the British Navy to enforce a policy that we also wanted, that this thing actually held and seemed to have any effect at all.
So you mentioned the revolutions in Latin America at the time and the crumbling Spanish Empire, and that is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that led to the Monroe Doctrine. But it's not the only revolution that's going on. There's another huge revolution, has a lot of political significance, military significance, but also cultural significance going on in Greece, beginning in 1820. And there's, like there is in Britain and other places, there's a massive popular movement in the U.S. to support the Greeks in their war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. Monroe is tempted to intervene, but John Quincy Adams is going to hold him back here. So, what's his thinking on that? Why is he sort of keeping or pushing the president to keep the U.S. from backing this independence movement in Greece?
So this leads to one of John Quincy Adams' most very famous speeches. It's a July 4th address that he gave in the House of Congress. And I love it because he didn't want to be seen as speaking on behalf of the administration. So he wore his Harvard robes, which I think is such a funny little detail. And he gave this address and he says, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the keeper of her own spirit and no other. That is essential because what the next thing he says is we have our principles, but if we can try and force them elsewhere, it's going to fundamentally change our character. It's going to make us into a militaristic power, which is going to degrade our ability to uphold our own liberties. And so what he's saying is not that we shouldn't be sympathetic, or even, I would argue in sort of today's parlance, like we could provide money and arms, but we can't actually enforce democratic principles anywhere else because that's going to change who we are. And he worried that if we got involved in that conflict, not only would it drag us into centuries-long battles between European nations, which we had no interest and really no economic interest in wading into, but that it would change who we are. And so I think that's such an important distinction because he is never making an isolationist argument. And he's never saying we shouldn't have alliances or even that we shouldn't support allies, but rather that we cannot try and recreate the United States somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, what fitting words for today. I mean, it's insane when you think about what he's saying there and what we've witnessed over decades in the U.S. and even more recently. But
well, I love that you say that because I'm working on this book on John Quincy Adams, and I sold the contract for it before the Monroe Doctrine was back in the news. And my argument was that this is actually a really relevant vision for what the United States can be because it's not an isolationist argument. It's not saying we shouldn't support allies. It's just saying world building or nation building is really hard, and building a republic in a place that isn't inspired to be one on its own is nearly impossible. And so we have no business doing it. And I think that is a message that resonates with a lot of people today.
Right. And I mean, to your point, I'm running a working group right now on the U.S.'s new policy towards Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine is getting tossed around quite a bit. The Monroe Doctrine, all of those things. But I want to push on that a little bit more because the Monroe Doctrine then is, unlike many things that get bantied about in the 250 years of American history, is one that keeps coming back. Right. It keeps coming, Theodore Roosevelt, and then, it switches over to sort of the good neighbor policy, but then it gets more interventionist again, obviously in the 60s and things like that, and is now getting tossed around again. So, why do you think that is the case, that this keeps coming back? And why is it so important in your mind to have a better understanding of the actual doctrine itself and the time period it was created, the circumstances, the context, all of that stuff when we're talking about it today?
Well, I think that I think the reason it comes up again and again is because no nation is ever truly isolated. We are incredibly blessed that we have two massive oceans on either side and then two incredibly friendly allies on our very, very long borders. And that is a position that we've been blessed with geography and, diplomacy that few nations can state that position. But as a reality, even with that incredible good fortune, we still have a lot of people that are in the region that are their actions and the actions of nations in the region are going to affect us. And I think there was a realization of that as early as, the 1810s, if not earlier. And so especially as these republics began to declare independence and to express their principles, by the 19th century, there was an understanding that nations that shared principles were more likely to get along. That if you shared principles, you were less likely to go to war. And we have now seen an enormous amount of social science that has proven that out, that democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies. But John Quincy Adams was essentially saying, about, South America, like these could potentially be really good partners down the road. And I think that concept has come up again and again. And the idea that a threat just over the horizon will never stay there is what has inspired statements by, like Theodore Roosevelt, which
Hmm.
his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is that if something happens in the Western Hemisphere that is potentially detrimental to the United States, then we will intervene, which is a much more proactively forceful
Hmm.
statement of intent to interfere than the Monroe Doctrine. I think it is important today because it is so misunderstood. It is misunderstood as a much more interventionist, much more imperial statement than I believe it was intended. Or it's viewed as sort of a much more isolationist statement from Europe and sort of the Eastern world, which it also was not. It's relevant today because the United States in maybe not the 1820s, but let's say the United States in the 1840s, I think is much more similar to the United States today than the United States in, say, the 1990s. We are not in a unipolar world. We're the only remaining superpower. We are not in a bipolar world where there are two superpowers.
Hmm.
We are still, of course, the most powerful nation, but there are a lot of other nations out there that can really throw a punch. And that is much more like the second half of the 19th century than the second half of the 20th.
Yeah. So moving away from the Monroe Doctrine for the last question here, um, we haven't actually gotten up to Adams's presidency. So he finds his presidency to be much more difficult than his time as Secretary of State. Uh, and that has a lot to do with the way that he ends up getting the presidency, which we don't have to
Hmm.
dive into too much here to get too into the weeds. But, you know, was there anything significant that came out of his presidency on the foreign policy front? And if so, what was that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think his presidency is tricky for a couple of reasons. The first is that there were massive tectonic shifts in the political system that would have
Hmm.
been impossible for almost anyone other than Andrew Jackson to manage because they were such massively shifting coalitions and a huge influx of Western voters and the huge influx of white suffrage. So men no longer had to own property in order to be able to
Hmm.
vote. And that fundamentally changed what politics looked like. And so Andrew Jackson was uniquely suited to capture the populist and slightly demagogic movement of the moment in a way that no matter what John Quincy Adams did, he was never going to be able to capture. And so I
Hmm.
think he was kind of defeated from the start. But he didn't make it better because he was intellectually suited to be a diplomat or to be Secretary of State or even to be a firebrand in Congress towards the end of his
Hmm.
life. He was not a very good executive and he was not a very good coalition builder, and that was required for the moment. But he did have a critical moment as president in which he gave this address to Congress, and it was in response to invitation from the South American nations. They were holding sort of this massive international conference, and they had invited the United States to send representatives just sort of as observers to kind of see what was happening or potentially as trade representatives. And John Quincy Adams wanted to send people there. And Congress, which was led by Martin Van Buren at the time, who, of course, was an Andrew Jackson
Hmm.
ally, basically defeated this effort to send this commission. And what's so interesting about the address that that John Quincy Adams delivered to Congress is he basically offers an updated version of the farewell address. He explicitly mentions it, and he explicitly kind of claims the mantle of being George Washington's ideological heir, which I think in a lot of ways he
Yeah.
actually was. But what he basically says is like the world of 1826 is not the world of 1796. The United States is in a very different position. The nations in South America are in a very different position, and Europe is in a very different position. We should act accordingly, and we should not necessarily bind ourselves to these republics, but they might make really good allies, and maybe we should
Hmm.
seek out that opportunity. And it is a remarkably forward-thinking and prescient document, and I think also one that's really overlooked.
Well, much like a lot of his thinking. So,
That's true.
well, listen, I appreciate it. I could talk JQA all day long, I actually, uh, one of my fun questions on my doctoral candidacy exams at the very end was who's the person from the 19th century you would like to have dinner with, or name three. And my first was definitely John Quincy Adams. Just the breadth of his life, from like knowing the founding fathers, serving as such a high level important positions as like a teenager, and
Mm-hmm.
then Secretary of State, presidency, then going back to the House of Representatives
Mm-hmm.
and being an abolitionist and serving there with Abraham Lincoln
Mm-hmm.
is I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that is just mind-boggling to me. So the
The way
stories you
that
could
I
get
just,
from that man.
I know the way that I describe it is, so he first comes in the history books in 1775 when Abigail took him up to a local hill to watch the Battle of
Hmm.
Bunker Hill. And he
Yeah.
leaves it in Congress, and a couple desks away is Abraham Lincoln. And in between, he was in Russia for Napoleon's invasion of Russia. He was in Paris when Napoleon came back after his sort of 100 days in exile. I mean, the man was everywhere and
Yeah.
saw everything, and it just blows my mind.
Yeah. No, it's crazy indeed. But well, listen, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all.